Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Scavengers Reign episodes 11 and 12. They are called The Return and The Reunion respectively. Spoilers for the episodes, these are the final episodes of the series and this is a Patreon sponsored show, so thank you very much to Alison for picking the show. So I was under the impression when I started this that it was just a limited series, but the ending of this final episode made me think otherwise, so I checked. And sure enough, it was a show that was cancelled after one season, not something that was always inherently meant to be just one season. So you can see them, the final scene in particular feels like it's setting some stuff up for a potential season 2, introducing a whole new group of characters that are very mysterious. You don't get a lot of them. You just get some visuals that are kind of weird and whatnot. This cult-like group in space that might obviously eventually get to the planet with the Demeter. But yeah, that caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that. I think I was under the impression this was a standalone show that was done and it was just finished, so I was expecting a complete ending. So not that really hampered how I felt about much, other than maybe that final scene just feeling a bit like, wait, this is setting stuff up. I'm never going to get any of this because because there doesn't appear to be a season 2, and sure enough, it was cancelled. But there's a lot of stuff in here to like in these last couple episodes. It's very action-packed relative to what the show has been, because it is all the plots converging as we get to the meter. Honestly, I find it very difficult to separate in my head what was episode 11 and what was episode 12, because everything does just kind of run on. Like Chris and Barry get to the Demeter. I think, the first time we see them in episode 11, they're arriving there. And then, they're there for the whole pair of episodes, pretty much. Outside of Chris leaving, of course, before the ending. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that it kind of teases and builds up. And as per usual, I'll start with just kind of like looking at the various characters and what they were doing throughout this. Ultimately, Azzy and Ursula team up. I was expecting Levi to maybe save Azzy, which is something that happens. It's a big moment in episode 12, but it happens later. Levi doesn't save Azzy from being tied up and left on the rocks. She tries to get a little creature to come over and use its claws, and she's really putting in the effort, but then the explosion from what Chris and Barry are doing on the ship scare it away and she screams. But it just so happens that when she screams, Ursula's close enough by that she hears it and goes looking for whoever screamed. Not that she was just hanging a bit on her own. Ursula had encountered what has become of Levi, who looks semi-organic now, and doesn't at first I thought she'd completely lost her memories. Levi, I really thought she was kind of like a new life form entirely and didn't remember who she was before. But obviously, the end of episode 11, which it does stick out quite a bit, is her finding the rope with the blood on it, the rope that was tying up Azzy. But I think more importantly, she doesn't just find this rope, she doesn't just stumble onto this rope. That rope is brought to her by a couple of the small creatures on the planet. They carry it to Levi, back to this new camp she's made where she's planting and farming and whatnot. Or as we find out later, growing her offspring. Thoughts on that too. But I think that's a very, very interesting choice, and it ties back into what I was saying last episode about how this yellow stuff that sort of becomes symbiotic with Levi is kind of like the planet trying to form balance again, because the Hollow has gained too much power, doing too many bad things. And I think this felt like that continuation of that line of thinking for me, because it was the planet going out of its way, the ecosystem going out of its way to tell Levi, hey, your friend that you had before is in trouble, which is interesting because not only does the planet or the ecosystem, however you want to phrase it, have a vested interest in dealing with the Hollow, but it also kind of feels like in some level respects the fact that Azzy means something to Levi, that Levi cares about her well-being, and the planet's saying, hey, we're not going to obstruct that. She's in trouble, maybe you should go help. And that kind of sets you up for like waiting for Levi to show up in the final episode and like, you know, get to that point. That was a really good little cliffhanger to end that episode on. That was really, really good stuff. And all this stuff with Cayman as well. We see a bit more Cayman inside the head, which also kind of like furthered the idea that the connection with the Hollow is kind of a two-way thing, because the Hollow comes across what's her name, Fiona, right, Cayman's ex-girlfriend, and kind of lies down next to her in a sort of moment of recognition, like the Hollow cares about her in some way. And it's kind of showing that as much as the Hollow's in control and is definitely the one that's driving the ship, some of what Cayman cares about is kind of feeding back into that two-way relationship. And this sort of leads to some more visions inside his head. And we get this insane visual of him up in the Demeter in space that's all broken up, but then comes like crashing down to the planet. And I think that starts in episode 11, but doesn't end until episode 12 when Levi shows up to take on the Hollow and actually fight it. Because probably the biggest moment to talk about out of both episodes is the moment where Cayman, not literally, but like metaphorically, crash lands down to the planet and hits the Hollow, right? And what that represents. And notably, it happens right after the Hollow tries to spit the black goo from its mouth, the same sort of goo that it uses to control Cayman and possibly feed him, and tries to put that into Levi, because Levi's got some like bio-organic parts now, and she has like a hole in her head, and it goes into this hole, and it's right when the black goo connects with the innards of Levi that we cut to Cayman like crash landing, and then the insane like sort of reel of visuals that happen after that, which feels like we're watching the formation of the planet, and we're seeing like the fires and the lava of the early days, and then the green, like, you know, appearing and growing over time. We see like the planet in space and the formation of all the life forms, and then eventually some of the sort of quick snippets of what's happened in the show so far. And then when we sort of like cut back to the real world and see the result of whatever's happening, the monster just kind of like disintegrates around Cayman until it's just the little baby version again from back from the start of the show, and Cayman's holding it in his arms and lets go, and they just kind of shoo it away. So there's a lot to process there, and a lot to kind of consider what's going on. And I'm just tilting my camera down a little bit. It was a little bit high. I think the way I read this is that, you know, I've been speaking especially recently about the planet being this ecosystem all kind of being connected, right? And it's all part of one big system. And that the yellow goo or gunk or whatever you want to call it that was in Levi was kind of connecting Levi to the planet. And this black goo that the Hollow has is how it connects to whoever it's controlling. So it seems like it's kind of a bad version of what the yellow gunk is. And in this moment, when the Hollow tries to connect with Levi, it feels like it's Cayman who's seeing all the things that the planet's connected to. Like the planet's history is all sort of beamed into Cayman's head, and arguably gives him the strength, whether or not he's choosing to or not. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think him jumping out of the spaceship and like crash landing and like going down does feel like a moment of defiance. It feels like he is sort of finally saying, no, I don't want this anymore, and he's trying to break free. But it's the moment where this connection happens, presumably because he's connected to the Hollow, and the Hollow is now connecting to Levi, that the yellow gunk and its power, it's the history of the planet and all that is winning the fight, right? By having that go through to Cayman, it's having him be able to overcome and take care of the Hollow, or it's doing it itself, but Cayman's left standing, you know, afterwards. That's what it felt like to me. It felt like, you know, he's been seeing these things through the black goo all season, right? Memories from his past that the monster's kind of manipulating or whatever. And then here it feels like one little connection to Levi who's connected to the planet as a whole, and it's so much more powerful, and it overrides everything, and it's this beautiful kind of like montage of creation, and it's very, you know, it doesn't feel evil, it doesn't feel dangerous, it feels very kind of, you know, awe-inspiring, like seeing all this planet and go through its history and all that. And I think this is a really neat sort of thing to have as your big sort of end point of your story, because the planet's ecosystem and just kind of oohing and eyeing at the various life forms and plant life and like the different parts of the world they've had to walk through have been kind of the star of the show in a lot of ways. It's kind of what the whole show has been revolving around. So it feels like a big deal thematically to end on this idea that the power of the planet itself is what ultimately defeats the Hollow. Yes, you've got Azzy being kind of badass and trying to stand up against it and has some action scenes running away from it and like dodging rivets and trying to stab it, but ultimately is going to fail because this thing is too powerful. All that stuff is fun to watch. Probably my favorite shot of the monster, actually, the Hollow, throughout these 2 episodes is in episode 12, I think, when Ursula's made her way to the cryo sleep room and she's at the console and she's trying to wake them up, and the Hollow kind of bursts through all of the cables and pipes that are kind of like very cyberpunk looking above the cryopods. It just kind of comes out. It's like a very sort of makes me think of like a Technomancer style scene where you've got something emerging from all the cables and wires and stuff. I really like that visual. I thought it was really cool. And she's kind of left as a sitting duck, and it kind of means that more of the crew die because she can't get to all the pods individually in time. More die than there need to be, and that's kind of on Chris as well. Which that's the other big thing about these 2 episodes is how much you kind of hate Chris by the end of. Now Chris has been kind of unlikable up until this point. She's been this antagonistic character for Azzy, and it feels like here she gets truly detestable with the way Barry's like, hey, all these people are alive in these cryopods, shouldn't we at least kind of help them before we go? And she's like, no, stop being selfish. You know, she has a way of turning it around to make it sound like Barry's the one who's being selfish or immature every time he wants to help with something. And he does stand up to her ultimately. He has his big moment where he says, no, we're not leaving, I want to go and help because these people, like, there's no reason why we shouldn't help these people. And she's like, well, I can't stop you, off you go. And honestly, he's so naive because he doesn't just assume that she's going to leave without him, which is exactly what she does. She just shuts the big, doors and takes off without him. And he immediately, like, if anything, there's probably a few colonists that are dead because he abandoned Ursula when he was supposed to be helping wake everyone up to go and cry at the window and say, no, please don't leave me. Please don't leave me. I also really appreciated that Chris didn't hear that because she wouldn't. There's no way with all those thrusters going off she would hear him banging at this window. So I was really pleased that they have her never look over at him or anything like that. She's completely left him behind, even already, like in her mind. So she's not even acknowledging that he's there, by choice or otherwise. It just works better that way, I think. So yeah, he's just kind of a wreck for the rest of the episode. And knowing that there was supposed to possibly be a season 2, it does kind of make sense leaving him in a position where he's still very upset about being left behind, but can grow and bond with these other characters over the potential second season. It's never going to happen now, but like you could see where they would go with that potentially. And same with all the characters as well, of course. Like, because I felt like Azzy and Levi get the biggest things in the finale. I mean, arguably Cayman as well, and Cayman's kind of left open to be like, okay, what is he now? Right? We kind of get this glimpse a little bit further ahead. We jump ahead in time. Ursula's hair's grown out a little bit. And clearly the colonists with their main characters have set up camp around the ship, and they've built a bit of a garden, they're doing all sorts of things. And we see that Cayman is nicer, we see that he is being kind to the creatures on the planet, maybe going further back to that idea that he's had even if he's not still connected to the planet like Levi is, he at least got like a taste of it, so he's kind of sympathetic to the creatures on the planet now. Because we see him sort of take this little critter outside and put it down gently, and it feels like a kind of a moment for him. So I think, again, in a season 2, you could see how you might progress and sort of like build him up more. Like, this wasn't some big redemption for him yet. Like, he definitely was making a choice in the right direction with trying to like fight the Hollow from the inside. But it's not like he got some big, like, I think because I assumed it was going to end, I was thinking, oh, he's probably going to die sacrificing himself to save everyone else, because at this point that feels like the redemption for him. But obviously, if they were going to keep going with the show and they wanted him around and they had ideas about where to take his story in a different direction, we could have maybe seen that based on where he's left off here at the end. So, yeah, but no, I do think that moment where he comes back down and the monster's defeated, and I think it's interesting as well that the monster's not even killed. The Hollow's not killed, it's just reverted back to its original size. And it's kind of like this idea that it's like it gained too much power. It was much more power than it was supposed to have because of the interference of this alien element, the human beings that have arrived. And because of those human beings, one in particular, but because of these humans' interference and messing up the ecosystem for a bit, it allowed this thing to get much stronger and more powerful than before, and it's not supposed to have that much power. And this felt like correcting that. It felt like rebalancing everything. And as far as like Cayman finally growing a pair, but not necessarily being this great character all of a sudden, I feel like that's very reminiscent of Barry, where he finally stands up to Chris a little bit, but does break down immediately when he realizes that she is leaving without him. So it feels like there's some parallels between those two. The show's had some good parallels between different characters throughout, and I think that's another example here, right at the end of the show. So. Yeah, Chris is just like so unlikable, and you're like, wait, is she just getting away with this? Because there's a moment when Azzy looks like she's about to die with the hollow, where I thought, oh, this is the big sad part before Levi comes in for the save. But Chris did get away in the ship, so that ends up being the final scene of the episode, as a tease for what would have become later, which is the ship that she's on. Because Barry picked up a flower and put it in his pack and put it on the ship. It's like changed the atmosphere, changed the life support system inside the ship. There's vines everywhere. And one of the things that's there is one of Levi's new species or children, depending on what you want to call it, a fully organic. We see this before this scene, of course, on the planet after the time jump. We see that Levi has grown little completely organic versions of herself, like a new species that's formed out of her and the planet kind of intertwining, if you will. And that's kind of interesting because this planet seems to have a lot of new life over and over again whenever there's a new element introduced and something kind of fits in. But it's left Chris like dehydrated and she's like begging for help. But we don't cut straight to her. We actually get a glimpse of like this ship that she's getting into, because I assumed it was just her ship, like her colony or something, like, you know, one of her like group's ships. But it isn't. It's some other entity that she doesn't recognize. And they're all dressed in masks. They have like a sort of cult vibe going off. They seem to be vaguely human. Maybe, I mean, we don't see their faces, so there could be a difference, but they seem humanoid, certainly. But they're very, like, just watching Chris, and then they're very curious by the organic Levi child that's on the ship. I find that very interesting. It definitely suggests that this group would be coming to the planet to investigate this, perhaps, in a season 2. But it is interesting to think, okay, they're kind of cult-like and maybe villainous, but we don't really know what they care about. I think they're going to, like, certainly the way it was presented made me think that them seeing this life form of Levi's child would make them interested in the planet. Now, why they're so interested in this kind of thing, I think is still a little bit open and something that a second season would have went into. But this was a really surreal scene, and like seeing this like completely new imagery of these characters and these outfits, I was like, whoa, I wasn't expecting anything like this. Like, what's going on here? So, you know, that was just kind of a wild thing, given the perspective I went into this episode with. But yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the pitfalls of doing them in pairs like this is that I feel like episode 11's kind of got in the shaft a little bit. I did talk about the ending and the tease of Levi and all that stuff. Obviously, that's where Azzy and Ursula kind of meet for the first time. I feel like if anything, it was Barry and Chris that got the lion's share of the screen time in episode 11, because it's like so much of them like exploring the ship, trying to clear the debris, forming the plan and what they're going to be doing. Barry trying to argue Chris a little bit that maybe they should help these people, because as I pointed out in the last pair of episodes, like Barry's heard about some of these people, particularly one, right? He's heard of Azzy's girlfriend, Mia is her name, and I think he even like looks over and sees her. I was almost expecting like a close up of the name or something, so that it'd be like, hey, I know one of these people. They're not just like not just a number and a bit of paper. There's a person I've been told about here who has interests and has a personality, someone that he can like connect to in some level, even though he's not actually met her. So, you know, I think that stuff works fairly well. You are kind of, if I was to make a critique about Barry's progression, is that I do think that maybe it's milked just a little bit too long, because, you know, he was already kind of like bonding with Azzy, and then kind of seemed to side with Chris, which felt like a setback, right? It felt like, oh, he was sort of like doubling down and trying to be determined that he was going to be by Chris's side because he's effectively been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but I did a lot of comparisons between Chris kind of like taking control of him in the same way that the Hollows taking control of Cayman. There's another parallel, but I talked about that in the last pair of episodes. I did kind of feel like as soon as he sees the cryo pods, he's immediately sort of like going back to exactly how he was before. It didn't really feel like, I think what I would have liked, ultimately he should still make the same decision. He should still stand his ground and say, no, we're going to stay and help these people. That's the conclusion to kind of this little arc he's on. But it felt like he immediately just started saying, hey, we should help them as soon as he saw the pods. And maybe what would have fit better for me, given that he seemed to be doubling down and saying, no, I'm with Chris, I'm going to follow her, she's my leader, is that when he saw the pods for the first time, instead of like instantly saying, hey, you sure we can't help them? Maybe he should have been like, holding back, like, hesitant, like maybe see it on his face that he wants to say something, see him doubt his commitment to Chris, but not actually have him try and push it on her. Yeah, because it definitely felt like when he brought it up again to her on the ship, and she's like, oh, this again? It kind of felt a little bit comical, because I was kind of thinking the same thing, where I'm like, yeah, it's kind of like, he is just bringing this up again, as opposed to it being something that's bubbling under the surface with him for maybe most of the episode, and then he finally kind of says, no, I'm not okay with this. I think maybe holding back on him having those doubts, at least verbally, have him maybe see it on his face, maybe see him struggling to like keep that commitment to Chris, but hold back a little until he finally starts voicing concerns. Because it felt a little repetitive with him just sort of asking like multiple times, like, you sure we can't help them? Because he says it once when he sees the pods, he brings it up again when they're sitting in the ship, and kind of just agrees to drop it because Chris says, really, this again? Like, just drop this. I think just waiting until the moment where he finally stands up to her, because we've already established, because it's not like we have to set this up anymore. We've already established the core idea here in previous episodes that he arguably is going to be more sympathetic to these people in these pods, but his commitment to Chris feels like, okay, that puts a cap in that for a little bit. But we've already established what the stakes are here. We already know what Chris is wanting to ignore and her not caring about the people in the pods. We don't have to set any of that up again. So having him just say it outright multiple times felt a little bit like it was, just regurgitating information, and made it feel a little bit, I don't know, just wonkier in the writing. I'll say it. It felt like a writing mistake to have him just say it multiple times. But it's a very minor quibble, all things considered. And it probably stuck out more in episode 11. And I think episode 11 suffers a little bit maybe compared to 12, because it is bouncing around probably the biggest group of characters that it's ever had to bounce around. Because we're bouncing from Azzy trying to get over restraints, to Ursula just on her own, and then eventually finding Levi, and then them meeting up together eventually when they converge. But you also have Barry and Chris, and there's also more Cayman in that episode than there had been for several episodes. So it was kind of bouncing around like 4 different plot lines in its like short runtime. And I think that, it felt like, it definitely felt like a penultimate episode, and that it was kind of like putting all the things in place for all the big things that were happening in 12. So I think inherently it doesn't feel as fulfilling as an episode on its own compared to a lot of the best episodes of the show, but it's very much necessary. And I think, honestly, it was kind of designed to be watched together with episode 12. It kind of felt right to watch it that way. As good as the cliffhanger is at the end of 11 to be like, oh, Levi's going to come and help Azzy, I don't think that it works. I think it works better watching it as one single 50-minute episode. And I've kind of felt that way about a lot of these pairs of episodes. I've been kind of surprised with, and maybe they were released this way at the time, maybe they put them out in pairs, but a lot of the pairs of episodes that I've done this way have really felt like thematically there's been a strong link between each pair of episodes, where it feels like stuff was set up in the odd number episode and then paid off in the even numbered episode. And that still feels true here at the end of the season. So yeah, it's a shame that it got cancelled and that there won't be any more. Luckily, outside of that tease at the end for this cult group, everything else feels like it does kind of pay off what the season had been doing. and clearly there was potential to go on and have Azzy have this full-time relationship with Mia, have Ursula take, her role as the new leader, but that she kind of inherited from Sam, whatever Cayman's going to do in his redemption tour, if you will. Like, there was lots of possibilities, and then Barry, of course, would have a lot of progression potentially as well. But they do feel like they all kind of wrap up what they were doing in this season with those characters. So it's fairly satisfying, even though it didn't get any more. I think I would have liked to have known that it was supposed to potentially continue before I watched it, though, or before I watched the finale at the very least. Just to set up my expectations and be aware that there was going to be some open threads that would have been continued had it not been cancelled. But as it is, like, I think it's an interesting show. Looking back overall at the season, I think some of my early worries about what the show could be, I think they were kind of partially true in some ways. Like, the idea that it was going to be just like 10, 11 episodes of them traveling to the ship might feel repetitive. Was a concern I had, and I do think that part of that is true. Like, I do looking back, it is just them traveling to the ship. It got lessened a little bit. The nice thing about the show is that as that potentially got a bit more tiring, the characters though got more fleshed out and more developed, and I cared more about them as it went on. So it kind of, like, in a weird way, counterbalanced that a little bit. And I didn't really feel like it was that much of a problem in the end. But I do, looking back at the whole thing now, 12 episodes at the end, I do, you can sum it up that way. Like, it's, it's 2 or 3 groups of characters traveling to the ship for an enormous amount of episodes, which in some ways, like, I think almost feels like it would have been better fit as a movie, as like a 1-2 hour thing, as opposed to something that was spread out over a season of TV. But the downside to that would be that you wouldn't have that time to set up the Levi and Azzy relationship and then kill Levi seemingly and leave that sitting for several episodes before you tease the return of Levi. Those sort of things work way better because we have more time to set them up. So the characters do absolutely benefit from this being a TV show and being 12 episodes, but I think the plot feels like it might have been better fitted to a shorter movie. Even if it was like a full 2-hour movie, would have felt more fitting for the type of journey that the characters had in terms of plot. Not so much character, like, progression in terms of their personalities, their themes, their arcs, that kind of thing. But in terms of just the plot of what they're doing, I think would have fit that sort of time frame better. But that's like a weird thing I'm saying here. I'm saying there's pros and cons to it being a TV show versus a movie, I guess is what I'm ultimately saying. But it's a very pleasant watch. I think the music's very good. The overall vibe of the planet is kind of unique and feels like it's just very different to most alien planets you get in a lot of TV and movies. I think that's what makes it stick out a bit more than anything. The idea that everything on the planet is connected and it feels like everything's this really complex ecosystem. And then by the end, this idea that there's kind of this positive, like, yellow goo that is like the connective tissue of the planet. And the fact that the black goo from the Hollows kind of almost the evil version of that is a kind of a really cool, interesting idea, and just sets up for this good versus evil or whatever you want to call it going on, but through a very different lens than we normally view those ideas. I think is quite interesting as well. It makes it feel like a unique science fiction show in that way. So, I mean, ultimately, I'm quite happy that I saw it. It's not the sort of thing that I'd have probably tried had someone not pushed me to, but I'm not mad. I think it has a lot to offer. I have to admit, I'm not someone who typically checks out a lot of animated shows for whatever reason. They tend not to hold my attention in the same way that live action does. Which is not to say there's not tons of good ones and that are better than a lot of live action ones, because there absolutely are. I have no doubt of that. But for whatever reason, it's just not something I tend to be drawn to. So, hey, if nothing else, I got to check out something that I wouldn't have watched otherwise, and it kind of clicked in some different ways than normal. But yeah, there you go. That is my thoughts on Scavengers Reign. It is now over. I don't know what I'm doing next for Alison. She'll have a video later in the month for something, but I don't know what it is yet. So thank you very much for joining me. You can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV. You can like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications, all those stupid YouTube things that everyone tells you to do. But more than anything else, Patreon or YouTube membership if you prefer. But any and all support is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?